Hi everyone, hello Australia. My name is Chris, as you can tell. Today we're going to be talking about TypeScript. How many people have heard of TypeScript? Yes, these are the TypeScript folks. How many people programmed TypeScript? Oh, no, not even Dimitri has programmed. Oh, you didn't. I'm saying not even Dimitri has programmed TypeScript. So this is kind of the what's the big deal with TypeScript. So I assume my understanding from my meetings today is that Australia equals JavaScript. Is that true? You guys program JavaScript? Yeah? Bunch of JavaScript fans? Is there anything about JavaScript you don't like, or is it perfect in all ways? A couple of people slapping their head like, duh. There are problems with JavaScript. So the point of TypeScript. TypeScript, here let me show you the universal entry point for TypeScript. So the place to start is TypeScriptLang.org. This is a programming language that was developed and implemented in the open source community by Microsoft. And in fact, it was invented by Anders Heilsberg. Anyone else? Anyone nobody's famous for? Yes?
C#.
He did C#. Yes. I thought you were going to tell me Turbo Pascal. Yes. Yes. But C#. And for me, that has always been my most favorite language. Every version of that language gets better and better, which is rare for computer languages. Mostly they get worse and worse. But I'm a fan of C#. So I'm a fan. So the fact that Anders had a hand in this is kind of a big deal. So the idea of TypeScript is every JavaScript file in the world today is a valid TypeScript file. Okay? So it is meant to be a perfect superset of TypeScript, of JavaScript. Right? So all of the crazy features, all of the patterns that we implement today to get namespaces and classes and inheritance and all of those things that we do to mimic scope in more progressive languages, all of those things we do with JavaScript today are all 100% TypeScript. However, all of those things that I mentioned in terms of those patterns that we apply, right? The things that we do to get classes, the things that we do to get namespaces, the things that we do to get scoping, those kinds of things are in fact built-in features in TypeScript. Okay? So let me give you an example. My favorite place to learn TypeScript is this play area of TypeScriptLang.org. And so, for example, let me just type, one of the worst lines of JavaScript ever. Right? If you see that line right here, what does that mean? In JavaScript. This is the audience participation portion of the lecture.
Initialization and assignment of possibly overwriting.
Yeah. Ben from the audience has said it could be one of many things, but for sure what it means is, assuming a browser environment, is this. Right? What it means is you've got a global variable. Okay? And the reason it means you've got a global variable is because JavaScript was invented to be as easy as humanly possible to get in the door. Right? In fact, Anders has a great quote, which is, JavaScript right now today is being used to build applications of hundreds of thousands of lines of code, but it was designed to build applications of hundreds of lines of code. Right? If you look at JavaScript, it's all about what is the smallest amount of code with the most amount of flexibility that we can possibly write. And of course, as software engineers, building projects with multiple people, building projects that stretch across files, right? That leads to a scaling problem. Right? A line of code like this is a problem because you've just created a global variable that you're now depending on and that anyone else in the program can now step on. Okay? One of the very first things I learned as a C programmer, right? Global variables are bad. Okay? Worse than go-to statements even, if you can believe it. Okay. So, notice, this is, by the way, TypeScriptLang.org. These are just On the left is just a TypeScript editor. Okay, so all the features of TypeScript with IntelliSense and statement completion and et cetera, are showing up on the left. And on the right is the equivalent JavaScript code. Because the way this works is the TypeScript compiler, all it does is translate the TypeScript language into JavaScript. Right? It is now one of hundreds of programs that translate their source code into JavaScript. I remember when I was a brand new developer, right? When we would write programs, what would we target? The output of a program, a compiler, what was the output of the compiler in those days? Some assembly language code. Probably x86 code, right? Actually, I go back to where it was 6502 code. But for most of my career, the assemblers were targeting x86 processors. Okay? More ARMs lately, but x86. And that's what all the languages would generate. Not anymore. Right? The cool thing that compilers are generating these days are JavaScript. And why is that? Why do all of these languages, literally hundreds of programming language, there is no matter what your favorite language is, somebody has written a version that outputs JavaScript code, guaranteed.
Web.
That's right. Right? The web has made JavaScript ubiquitous. Right? I can sit down on my grandmother's computer and with Notepad and the browser and build Facebook. Okay? It is ubiquitous. JavaScript is ubiquitous. In the same way that x86 used to be ubiquitous, JavaScript is ubiquitous like that, several orders of magnitude higher. Okay? So all of these languages are targeting JavaScript as their output. Now, this is another one. This is one, but this is a shining example. This is the only one, because if we have things like CoffeeScript, or if we have things like Python script or ClojureScript or whatever, right? Those are all languages that are different from JavaScript. Right? Google has one. Anyone know what the Google language is that translates directly into? What's that?
Dart.
I can't hear.
Dart, D-A-R-T, Dart.
Dart. Thank you. Yes. Dart. Dart is the Google language, and it is meant to be kind of a cross between C and C#. Okay, maybe a little bit of Java-ish, right? And it's a C language family. It's a C family language, definitely, but it is not JavaScript. Right? TypeScript is the only one that you can take all of your JavaScript, dump it into TypeScript, and keep going. Okay? Now, what it does is it takes JavaScript and adds features optionally. For example, in this particular case, it's complaining, right? It's giving you an error message with the underlined red squiggly, and in fact, you can hang your mouse over and see specifically what the error message is. But it is still generating JavaScript. Right? In this case, the TypeScript compiler's output is a warning and then completely legal JavaScript, which means we're going to tell you did something bad, but we're going to let you do it. Because that's what JavaScript is. Just a bunch of bad things that we all do together. Right? Okay. To make it better, we can say, that's a variable. At least we've scoped it to this file. If it was inside of a function, we'd be scoping it to a function. Great. Now, another thing we can do is we can add optional type information. For example, we can say this is a string. Great. Notice that JavaScript is identical. Okay, there's no runtime overhead. No one's checking to make sure it's a string. However, if I do this, now the compiler has enough information to say, hey, you said this was going to be a string. Okay. Again, completely valid, legal JavaScript. Okay. If you wanted it to be a string or a number, you just say this. Okay. So the built-in types are available to decorate your declarations. And you can do the same thing with functions. You can say x number, y number, and you can say, oh, and it returns a number. And in fact, let's implement this. Okay. Okay. Function that takes two numbers returns a number. And if I did this, it would complain. Okay, because that's a string. Okay, now, notice the JavaScript. The idea of TypeScript is it would give you the JavaScript that you would type. Now, let's say that we didn't want to make this a global function, because that's what this is right now. Right? What if we wanted to give it a scope? What if we wanted to put it in a namespace? In JavaScript, there's all kinds of funky code to put things inside of namespaces. So you can say, you know, let's call it my math namespace. Okay. So here in JavaScript, I get to say, hey, this goes in a module. Great. And then here in JavaScript is what I would normally have to type. Okay. Now this is it turns out to be slightly more code than you would normally type, but it's also more general purpose. And as we start doing other things inside of a module, right, you want a structure that looks like this. But it basically boils down to the sum function is now on the myMath, inside the myMath module in TypeScript, and that means there's a math function or a sum function in the myMath object, which we treat as a namespace in JavaScript. So for example, if I say var x equals myMath dot, and then notice that sum is in the IntelliSense. Okay, 2 and 2. Now, anyone know why? Anyone guess on the red squiggly? Because this is completely legal JavaScript on the right-hand side. Anyone have a guess as to what the red squiggly is?
Reusing X?
Nope, not reusing X, but that is a good guess. If we look at the error, it says the property sum does not exist. And the reason it's saying that is because we built a module, and by default, everything inside the module is private. Right? It is not exported. So for example, if I say, and in fact, if you look, right, we created a function sum, but we never stuck it on the myMath object that we passed it in. Okay, if you want to stick it in there, you say, oh, I'd like to export this from the module. And now notice, oh, myMath.sum equals sum. Right? We've now exported it, and the error goes away. Okay. Likewise, if we did something like this, you can put we can put a string variable on there, which is a very common thing to want to do. Have a privately scoped data to be used by functions in that module. If we want to export it, we can. Okay, same kind of thing. Questions about any of that? Does any of that look interesting? To be able to type the thing on the left, which is semantically what you mean, but still get the thing on the right, which runs everywhere. And you might think, well, sure, right? If I want to type this into a browser and copy and paste this code, that looks pretty cool. Turns out you can download and install the compiler, and you can make it run on ASP.NET backend. You can make it run on Windows 8 front end if you happen to be doing JavaScript and HTML. You can install it into Node as a package, right? So you can write, myserver.ts, compile it down to, and use all, and import and use all of the Node functionality. Okay, so I've known people who have actually used TypeScript just to take all of their TypeScript files, not use any of the functionality, just move it to TypeScript. They were building a Node server, and just to get the compiler to point out all of the errors that they hadn't found yet. Okay, they did not use any of the new functionality, just thousands of JavaScript files that they wanted the compiler to check for them. Okay.
Can you write TypeScript in a Windows 8 app, or would you teach compilers to JavaScript and put it in Windows 8?
Good question. Ben asked, can I write TypeScript in a Windows 8 app, or do I have to compile it manually? It turns out you can do it, and I'll show you how to do that. Great. Okay, let's say I wanted to build something else here. Let me build a class, and let's build a person class. And person will have a name, and an age. Okay? Again, we've used a new feature here in TypeScript. We've actually built a class in the way that we think of them. Of course, we still are using instances and prototypes, just like we do in JavaScript. It's just, as it happens, what is a class in JavaScript? It's just a constructor function, right? And so we're setting up this empty constructor function. We're setting up this class. If we want to provide code in that constructor, we can do that. All right. And you might think, well, where do these keywords come from? Because these are new features, right, that TypeScript is adding. As it turns out, every place that they can, even though we're generating ECMAScript 5 compatible code, these are actually keywords from the proposal for ECMAScript 6, right, which is still being worked on. It has not been ratified. It hasn't even been, the draft hasn't even been completed yet. But what Microsoft has done is saying, hey, there's a bunch of these features coming. We're going to give you the ones that we can give you now that generate JavaScript code, and we're going to use that same syntax so that you're familiar with it. For example, constructor and class and module. These are proposals for ECMAScript 6 keywords. The typing is not, right? That is just a TypeScript feature. Okay. So now let me do this. Name equals name. This dot age equals age. And now let me create one. And I'll and equals new my module dot person. And Ben, I'm guessing, what are you, about 29? That's my guess. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone know, again, the red squiggly? This. Yeah, we didn't export it. Okay, great. Now, what if we wanted to make any of these optional? These are optional parameters. For example, it's very common in JavaScript to be able to make functions that can just deal with parameters and they're there or they're not there or whatever. And in this particular case, the TypeScript compiler is saying, sorry, you can't do that. You don't match the signature of the constructor. But you can do this. You can say that's an optional parameter. And then you can do the normal JavaScript thing. If not age, right? Age equals, whatever. You can do that. And you can set the default in a normal JavaScript way, okay, by making it optional. Or you can do this. You can say this parameter is optional and it has a default value. Okay? And notice almost the exact same code is generated for me. Okay? We can also do things like this. Class, employee, inherits, or what's it called? No, not implements. I forget what the keyword is. Oh, here it is. What is the keyword? I forget. Let's see. Oh, this is going to bother me. Oh, I'll think of it in a second. The other way to go is this, an interface. Let's say we have one of these. And again, it has a name and an age. Notice a couple of things that are happening here is I'm not saying var, right? I'm not saying function. In fact, if I do another function, which is to string, return this dot name plus this dot age. right? The function keyword is missing. One of the things that I notice that I get tripped up with is if I'm inside a class, I don't use var or the function keyword, and if I'm outside a class, I do. Okay? I'm not particularly happy with that part of their decision-making process, but there you go. Okay, anyway, I have an interface called iPerson. There is no implements. I don't say that person implements iPerson. Instead, what I can do is say, I've got a, Ben is a type of iPerson, my module.iPerson, and I need to export it. And the compiler is happy. Why is the compiler happy? It's duck typing, exactly right. The compiler checks. Oh, do these types match up? For example, if I said friend count, I'm spelled like Steve now.
That takes effort.
Yeah. It's still compatible, right? Because it is a subset. Great. What if I said, oh, a person has, actually, let's move friend count over here. And now there's going to be the compiler is going to complain because it's going to say, sorry, person is not a person. And so we're comparing at the instance as opposed to at the type, which is a very JavaScript thing to do. Okay, we're doing duck typing. All right, great. Yeah, question?
Extends.
Thank you, extends. Class employee extends. There we go. Person. Great. And then in that case, extends means inherits from, right? It's an inheriting relationship. And it generates this weird boilerplate function which does all of the actual setting of the... And this is the only time that TypeScript actually generates code, little helper code like this. In general, all it does is generate the exact same code that you would write if you were doing this in JavaScript. But extends is a little helper function. And notice here, we can say employee extends. And this is pretty close. Here's the person being passed in. This is pretty close to the kind of code you would write in JavaScript. Maybe not. Maybe you'd write slightly simpler, but it's pretty close. Which is, of course, why people look at JavaScript and they go, what the hell is going on? Because in JavaScript, we have all of the capabilities we need. Nobody can argue that JavaScript is an extremely capable language. The problem is that to get there, we have to build all these patterns on top of all of on top of a very few number of features. And the idea of TypeScript is, let's make those concepts that we use over and over and over again part of the language. Okay? One other one that I really like, this is probably my favorite one. This has made my life better. If I say, let's say I had, in fact, let's get rid of person altogether. Oh, no, I want to keep person. Let's say I had an array of integers. Okay? And I use the for each function on them. Right? And ECMAScript 5 has this wonderful filtering, map reduce, right? All of these wonderful functions. It's very link-like on the array class. One of my favorite features of JavaScript, or of C# is in JavaScript already, right? So I can say for each. And normally I'd write this function, for each I. I got to move the mouse. Great. And that's fine, and I can just write my function in here. And let's say I wanted to keep track of the sum of these numbers. Great. In my person. Okay, pretty contrived. Now, if I say this, plus equals I. If I'm reading that code, what do I want this to point to? I'm inside the constructor, right? I'm calling sum. I want it to point to the object that I'm working with, right? But if I'm inside one of these contexts, right? Maybe I'm inside an event handler, right? If I'm inside of one of these contexts, what does this really point to in a JavaScript function? Yeah, as it turns out, it is hard to know what this actually points at. In this particular case, I believe it's the array itself and not the object in which I'm writing this code. Okay? And in fact, if I let the compiler tell me, it doesn't have any real useful information. Okay? And that is one of the single biggest parts of bugs in JavaScript code, is that this pointer almost never points to the thing you really mean it to point to. So what Microsoft did was they said, you know what, we're going to implement a new lambda syntax, because we're essentially saying, I want to pass in an anonymous function on the fly. And that's a lot of typing. I don't need all that typing. I can do something like this. I can say, here's a lambda with a set of parameters and the arrow and then the function body, and then that's the whole thing. Right? I could probably get all that on one line. Much more compact syntax. And because it's brand new syntax, they get to decide what they do. What they do is they make this point to something reasonable and rational. Okay, and they do that inside of event handlers, and they do that inside of all kinds of contexts where you really want this to mean something specific. How do they do it? They do the same trick that we do to make it be what we want. Right? They capture it outside, and then inside they use. The other way to do it is with bind. Okay? But they do the same code that we would have to type to make sure that that variable is what we want it to be. Okay? All right. That's pretty much it. That's TypeScript. There's a little bit more that I'll show you in a minute, but questions about TypeScript? What do you think? You like it? Dimitri?
Can you debug TypeScript? I mean, not just produce, but debug.
That is an excellent question. I will get to that in a minute, Dimitri. Yes, you can. The short answer is yes, you can debug TypeScript. And that's because TSC, the TypeScript compiler, has a source map command line argument that will give you source maps that you can use with browsers and etc. Other question? Any other questions? What do you guys think? You like this language or not like this language?
I like it.
Did I hear love? Do I hear some TypeScript love over here?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, okay.
Can I ask a question?
I love it too, by the way.
Can I ask a quick question about compiling?
Yes.
So I noticed that there's something called .less for CSS less files where you can add a HTTP handler and have it compile.
You're talking about ASP.NET and its support for .less files. Yes, that's correct.
Is there something similar with TypeScript? I can have some kind of HTTP handler, or do I have to compile?
Oh, that's a good question. There is built-in support. So the question is, hey, what if I have .ts files, because that's the convention for the instead of .js files. What if I have .ts files in my Visual Studio projects? Can I have them just build automatically as part of my compilation, or can I have them build on the fly? The answer to the first one is you can have them build automatically, and it's just part of MS Build. I don't know if you can have them build on the fly like you do on .less files, but it's very easy to use the TSC compiler. So even if that HTTP handler didn't exist, it's about 4 lines of code to make it work. Okay, so you could do it if you wanted. I'm a fan of compiling at compile time, right? But you could make it happen in the HTTP handler. Okay, so I've shown you what I wanted to show you inside the browser, and we got kind of far inside the browser. Now let me show you this in a real-world scenario. Now I have spent the last 2 years doing a ton of JavaScript and HTML5 and CSS3 in the context of Windows 8. Okay, so I've been doing a bunch of Windows 8 programming. Okay, so when I would start up Visual Studio and say File New Project, I would get all these apps that would generate JavaScript for me, but then I'd have to manually move them to TypeScript so I could get all these wonderful TypeScript functionalities. And it turns out to be a pain in the behind to set all that up properly. So what I did was I took 3 of the templates that I use most, actually I took the one template I used most and two that were easy to do afterwards, and I made those into TypeScript. So I went in, generated all of these projects, translated the JavaScript into TypeScript, set the projects to make them work, and then built them into templates. And they're all on salesbrothers.com. So if you want to do this with Windows 8 programs, right now it's the very first post, the very top post on my blog, salesbrothers.com. Okay, so you can download these and go crazy. All right. So let's start with one, and let me just show you how it's structured. How many people have written Windows 8 apps in the room? Ben has, yes. No one else has. So if we do an intro to Windows 8, we can do that, but let's get through the TypeScript first stuff, if you guys are interested. Okay, so now I'm inside of Visual Studio. Notice that I've generated a project, and by default, the template opens up the TypeScript file for the homepage. Okay, because I have two things installed. I have the Visual Studio plugin for TypeScript installed, right, which means that the build system works and the TypeScript compiler is available to me at the command line. And I have the latest version of Web Essentials installed, which does all kinds of things like less support, right? It has less support. But it also has, in this latest version, what is it? Tools, options. Web Essentials, TypeScript. Okay, so out of the box it supports TypeScript. And you can set like compiler options. For example, when you want to generate a source map, so you can do debugging, you can do that. Okay. Now, the other thing you get is as you type and save, you get the JavaScript on the right. Hello, there it's compiling. It's generally not this slow. It's a brand new project. Hello, there we go. Okay. Now, I keep this here just for sanity, but more and more I don't even look. Couple of features that you haven't seen before in TypeScript. Notice that I made it use modules in the way you'd expect, and it gets back to the same namespaces it was using. Notice this reference. If you want TypeScript, the TypeScript compiler, when you spread it out across files, it needs to know what the other types are. It's not like C# where you just have a big soup and it finds all the types and does as many compilation passes as it needs to. It's more like C or C++. You have to have include files to define the types. Okay, and that's what this little triple comment reference means, which is kind of an include file. Right? So I've got a declare.ts that I'm bringing in. Now the other interesting thing about if we look at declare.ts, it's bringing in some .d.ts files. One of the questions I'm surprised I haven't gotten yet, and I think it's just because you were dazzled by the beauty and wonder that is the language itself, is nobody has said, hey, what if I want to use existing JavaScript libraries? Because those JavaScript libraries don't provide any type information. Steve, was that the question you were going to ask?
I want to use existing JavaScript
Excellent.
libraries.
Stephen Forte has that same question. How coincidental. I know. So the way you can certainly use all of those JavaScript files. You can make all those calls from inside of TypeScript, and it will tell you all the errors, but they will be warnings, and you can move on with your life. Okay? However, if, like me, the reason you use a compiler is because you treat those warnings as errors and you want to fix them, what you do is you give it the type information. And the way you give it the type information is with these .d.ts files. Right? These are TypeScript declaration files. And all it is, remember when I did like module and export and blah, blah, blah? There's another keyword which is called declare. Let me show you that one. For example, let me pull up, how many jQuery programmers do we have in here? A couple? Okay. This is the type information for jQuery, all rendered as TypeScript. Okay. There's no behavior here. right? jQuery is assumed to be brought in with a .js file, which is, of course, how they ship it, right? All this is a description of all the interfaces on jQuery.
We're back to MSIL.
Yeah, this is, right, exactly right. This is IDL.
IDL, yeah.
Yep, IDL files. Or, you know, .h files, right? These are header files. But the reason is that you can add this type data after the fact and bring it in, and it will give you the IntelliSense, it will give you the compile time to check your errors, even against projects or libraries that that weren't written in TypeScript. And in fact, there is on either up on Codeplex, there's a big project all about, you know, popular libraries like Knockout and Mustache and jQuery and jQuery UI and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The TypeScript equivalents for those files that you can just download and put in your project and include, and off you go.
So is there like an OLE view for TS code?
Right. Someday. So the ones that come out of the box, and I put these in because these are the ones that came in the Windows 8 sample that they included, are the ones for jQuery, the ones for the HTML DOM itself, right? Element, HTML element, mouse event, args, etc. The one for WinJS, it's only partial, and the ones for the WinRT. These are Windows 8 programming things. Okay. So that's the story there. Now, if I run it, all it does is, this particular template does almost nothing out of the box. All it will do is compile everything and, you know, ship it. And now I'll run it. This, and this is the slowness of my machine starting up the debugging environment. The JavaScript is identical. Come on.
Just while it's waiting, for folks who use Kendo, we announced earlier today that we're going to be shipping those .d.ts files alongside our JavaScript files in the next release.
Cool.
So we're supporting TypeScript in the next.
Excellent. Somebody asked, well, how do I debug? Which is an excellent. So I just added a line of code here. I can debug by pressing F9. In fact, I got the wrong line of code. Okay. And let me just do a refresh. I can't remember if I have to tear down the compiler here. As it turns out, these are very much CTP, like alpha. It's not like beta, right? Feature complete, ready for you to try, give us feedback. It's like CTP, which really just means guaranteed to take up room on your hard drive. Right? So there are glitches, there are issues, right? You can debug, you do have it, the ability to stop at breakpoints and et cetera, and now I'm at one. Here we go. I'm at a breakpoint, and right now X is undefined because I haven't executed this line of code, and I can step over, right? And then I get the call stack, which is what you're seeing down here, et cetera.
That's compiling to JS code.
Right.
And so the debugger understands where you're at with the JavaScript and translates it back again.
Yes, and that's
very cool.
That's what source maps are all about. Source maps are all about mapping the lines of code back to the source language. Because TypeScript is now amongst a family of hundreds of languages that are using JavaScript as a assembly language, and so they've come up with a way to solve this problem, and Microsoft is following that convention. Okay? And that means that you can, whatever node debugger you happen to use, you can do the exact same thing, right? Whatever client-side debugger you happen to use, right? You can do the exact same thing. Stephen Forte.
So help me understand, this is a .js file in Visual Studio?
No, this is home.ts.
Oh, a TypeScript
This
file.
is a TypeScript file.
So are you going to talk to us about how that integrates that in your project? I mean, I know you just talked about how it's side by side, but like, what if I wanted? Let me ask the question differently. What if I wanted it in the same page, like as an embedded? Can I embed TypeScript?
Good question. Can I say, like for example, in fact, let's look at the HTML that pulls this in. If we look at home.html. Steve's question was, hey, what if I want to have like a script tag that brings in a .ts file? And the answer is you can't. Right? Notice that in home.html, it includes the .js file. Okay? As of right now, that's where we are on the tools and the technology. There's nobody that's the IE does not implement support for TypeScript.
If they had a MIME type declarator,
Right.
they could-
Right. And of course, the reason they don't do that is because then they would have to make everybody support it. Otherwise, nobody would care. You couldn't use it. But the way they're doing it now is because they provide the compilers in all manner of back-end systems. They have a subtext plugin for TypeScript syntax highlighting, right? I mean, they have done it right. They built a node package. They built the whole thing as open source with a real open source license and have exposed all the source code to TypeScript. Okay. John.
What's the TypeScript compiler written in?
Good question. What is the TypeScript compiler written in? I know that at least some of it is written in JavaScript because you saw the IntelliSense that all came up when I was typing on that browser.
I'm just thinking, if they added the MIME type to the script tag and specified it, then kicked off the
Sure.
TypeScript compiler on client side, you could make that work.
Sure.
You could include TS. That's how template languages work in JavaScript.
Right.
Because then you
Right.
get better interface. Yeah.
Sure. Good. Yes, question.
Chris, would you mind showing us the structure in Solution Explorer?
Yeah.
Please.
Great. So let's take a look. So the structure of our project, which I'm showing by request, is I've got my CSS just like I would normally have. I've got my declare file, which is all the .d.ts files. I've got some images, and then I've got my JavaScript file, which happens to be .ts files, which generate .js files. Okay.
Does it generate that at compile time or runtime?
It generates these at compile time, right? It's part of the build process, and I'll show you the build in the
The build will be just standard JavaScript files.
the deployment is standard JavaScript files. The build is TypeScript files. And so again, notice home.ts with the home.js.
If you go and change something in the JavaScript files and you build it again,
Good.
does it override it?
The question is, what if I put extra code in the JavaScript? Will it override it? And the answer is absolutely yes, and it will do so without even blinking. Right? You could put the implementation of the next great app in there, and it will be gone. So don't do that.
Is there support for partial?
Good question. Are there support for partial? Let's. The way to find that out. There's, to my knowledge, there is no partial keyword. However, what happens if we do? Let's get rid of all this silly code. What if I do this? What if I say? Right. I want to put part of my class here, and so the red squigglies mean something's wrong, right? Duplicate. What if I say, because this is what we really want, right? Yeah, nope. Now, as it turns out, we're at version 0.8 in this language so far. They have published their roadmap. I don't know if partial classes is on the list for their roadmap, but they do have some interesting things. For example, if you're an JavaScript programmer these days, especially in the front end, you're doing a lot of async programming, a lot of callback-based programs, which, you know, in C# 5.0 with the async and await keywords has been made much, much better. They have that on their roadmap for post V1, so that you could actually write async and await in your TypeScript, and out would come all the callbacks, the nested callbacks, as generated JavaScript, which would be huge, right? That alone would be worth the whole language. All right, so no partial classes, unfortunately. At least not with the keywords that I can guess. Now let's pull up so I can show you there's nothing fancy here. I'll pull up the project. Oh, it's actually running. Edit. And so you'll see if you look at the TS files, you'll see that I do the standard, hey, JavaScript is in fact dependent on TS, and that's how you get the hierarchy, right? So it shows the TS file, and then you drill in and it shows the JavaScript file. And then at the bottom, now, the thing that compiles it as you type it, that's Web Essentials, right? And that's the thing that shows you the dual window. Okay, but the thing that compiles it as you deploy it is MS-build. And so here's the use of, where is it? tsc.exe, TypeScript compiler. Okay, and then notice I'm saying by default I want ECMAScript 5. I can go back all the way to ECMAScript 3 if I want to. I don't even know what that code looks like. That's scary. And then the other thing is I brought in the source map, right? That allows the debugging. Okay. All right. And then just so I can show you that I'm using this for something real, I have a little project that I've been working on. That's where I want it. So before I can show you my little project, I have to tell you a story. Late last year, well, backing up, my mother and my youngest son are both excellent at word games. Right, at holiday gatherings, family gatherings, they always want to play Boggle or Scrabble, and they always kick my butt, right? Totally blow me away. Never been good at them. And as an author, this kind of upsets me, right? You'd think I'd be good at that kind of thing, but my brain just doesn't work that way. So as it turns out, late last year, my mother said, "Oh yeah, you were diagnosed as dyslexic as a kid. We just didn't tell you." And she said, "Didn't you have a clue when you couldn't spell anything?" And I'm like, "No, I just thought I couldn't spell anything, right? I didn't know I was dyslexic." Okay, so now that I'm officially like handicapped in some way, I didn't feel bad when I wrote this app I'm about to show you. So what I'm building is all in TypeScript and HTML and CSS. It's all based on Windows 8. It's all touch-based. Okay, and what it allows me to do, and I'm not done with it yet, assuming it comes up here in a minute, is it allows me to actually, how many people play Words with Friends? Okay, I'm in the middle of a game with my son, and with all of like the online ScrabbleCheat.com, he's still kicking my butt. Okay, so the problem with those games is you can say, hey, I want to show, here's my letters, right? Give me all the words, but that doesn't take into account the position on the board and the triple letter scores and the double word scores and et cetera, et cetera. So what I have done, come on. Oh wait, is it? I know why. Yeah, that's why. Because Visual Studio crashed. I hate when that happens. Did I mention that TypeScript isn't done yet? This is how you know it's real code. Windows.
TypeScript?
Yeah, it's TypeScript. Definitely TypeScript. Windows 8 is great. Visual Studio is great. That's definitely TypeScript. Okay. If you move the mouse, did you guys know this? It goes faster.
But we left that in 1990.
Yeah, no, it's still there. That same principle works for crosswalks, right? If you bang on the crosswalk button, it'll change faster. And elevators.
That was the case for 14K modems, wasn't it?
If you bang on them. And in fact, that bit about, this I was at a teaching years ago, and I told that little story about how, something demo was going slowly, so I moved the mouse, and I told them the whole story. This one is actually one I expect. Continue. Great. So I told that whole story, and then it was like a 12-hour, 5-day, 60-hour teaching marathon. And we took like time in an afternoon to go swimming, and we were all standing around the elevator waiting to go get our swimsuits on to go for a swim. Right? And I just told that story about, hey, if you move the mouse, it goes faster, and the same thing works for elevators. And so we were all standing there, very politely, 50 or 60 developers, very patiently waiting for the elevators, and there was a family there with a little kid. And we were all waiting, and they had already pushed the button for the elevator, and we were all waiting. And I leaned down to the little kid, and I said, if you push the button more, the elevator comes faster. And he looked up at me. Of course, he looked up at me. He looked up at me. And he just reached over and he started hammering on the button. And just when he started doing that, the elevator doors opened. And the mom looked at me and went, thanks. I ruined that kid forever. Okay, so what I did is I built the Words with Friends board. And the idea is that I can just put the letters wherever I want. And it crashes, of course. Let's see what else happens. And then what I can do, let's see what state I'm in. Oh yeah, I'm way dead. But I can put the letters, the idea is I can put the letters in the little tray on the bottom. And it will, I can press the button and it will find me all of the words. Right, and it'll look at the double letter scores and the triple word scores and find the position. And I don't feel bad about writing this program because I'm dyslexic. I need this program.
You're building a program to cheat against yourself.
No. I'm building a program to compete unfairly against my son. How about that? You like that better?
No.
No, okay. And all of this is built with TypeScript, right? Each one of those pieces is a WinJS control that is also a TypeScript class. Okay, and of course I'm using CSS and HTML5 as well. But the whole thing was much faster written using TypeScript, and it's very few lines of code compared to what it would be in JavaScript. Because with the JavaScript, right, as I start using classes and the functions and et cetera, the code gets bigger and bigger. It's much clearer code, much easier to read. Okay. That's a real world program I've built. And TypeScript came out, I don't know, a couple months ago or something. It's pretty new. Okay. So that's TypeScript. Questions about TypeScript? Ben, did I answer your question about TypeScript? And yeah, okay. All right.
Can I ask, do you know how big the team that Anders used to build it?
Good question. How big is the team that Anders is using? I'm guessing it's pretty small. I'm hoping that he has made it open source. I'm hoping that if I make contributions, I know that they have they're using the list of errors, right, to say, hey, I want this feature and I want that feature, right, in a very open source kind of way. I don't know if they're taking contributions from the community yet, right? But if they could take contributions from the community, so there's certainly external projects around TypeScript. If you've got a Codeplex, you go to GitHub, you search on TypeScript, you'll find a bunch of stuff. Right? So people are really using it. Small number yet, but they are using it. I don't know if Microsoft is prepared to take contributions from external sources yet. They are on ASP.NET, so I'm hopeful. And if they can do that and it becomes popular, suddenly they've got the whole world building TypeScript as opposed to, just, I'm guessing half a dozen or less people at Microsoft total. Yeah.
So do you think that it's going to get traction with outside Microsoft developers?
Good question. So the question was, hey, is anyone besides disgruntled C# users ever going to use TypeScript? And the answer is, I don't know. And of course, Microsoft is handicapped in this way already. Right? Microsoft is handicapped because they're Microsoft, and they've been proprietary software for so long that even when they do something, they coined their own term. The whole world was moving open source, and they coined their own term, shared source, right? Which meant that you can look at it, but you can't do anything else with it, right? You can't contribute, you can't, all kinds of restrictions. So they have built themselves a reputation in the open source community to not be playing by the same rules as everyone else. So when they start stepping into the open source community, they're already at a disadvantage. That said, I know that because ASP.NET is now open source, they are really taking contributions from third parties, and I know it is being used in places that it wouldn't have been used, right? Ex-Ruby developers taking a look at ASP.NET, that kind of thing, right? Because it is open source. Microsoft, as far as I can tell, with TypeScript, is doing everything they can possibly do right. They're developing it out in the world. It's available open source with a real open source license, node packages, subtext, syntax highlighting rules, right? They're doing everything they can think of to do it in the right way. So I'm hopeful that external, outside of Microsoft people will use it.
Just on your comment with shared source, wasn't that seen fairly favourably with larger enterprises that, that more eyeballs are seeing the code that Microsoft's developing, but Microsoft still take responsibility for it?
Yeah, so that's so Adam had a comment that, hey, enterprise is happy that Microsoft is doing the combination of the best parts of the two things they do. They're making their code open for examination by other eyeballs, which is a good thing. They didn't used to do that, especially for something so core as ASP.NET, for example. But they're still supporting it, right? Enterprises still have a place to go to say, hey, that doesn't work. So to me, it seems like the best of both worlds, right? Because normally in an open source community, you kind of get one, but you give up the other one, right? But Microsoft is doing it in a way that is the best of both, which is pretty cool. And it represents a major change from the policies of the past.
I'm still thinking, what would be the business case that Anders Hallsberg goes off and says, I want to develop this language that will help JavaScript developers? Like, wouldn't they usually need some business case of why they're going to do this?
Good question. Why is it okay that Anders does this? Two reasons. One, because he's Anders, right? He gets to do whatever he wants, right? He's a technical fellow at Microsoft. There's only a few number of those, and they have broad range of responsibilities and privileges, right? And certainly he's earned his stripes, right? He has done great things for Microsoft. Two, Microsoft wants Windows to be the best possible platform for running HTML, right? They're the ones that that started the whole deal with hardware optimized HTML and CSS, right? They're IE9. They invented that. Everyone else followed after them, right? They just recently rewrote their entire JavaScript engine to be smaller and faster and to compete with Chrome, right? They care deeply about making sure that Windows is a fabulous environment for running the web, for browsing the web. And they care deeply that Microsoft and Windows is a fabulous environment for HTML developers, right? Look what the decision they made with Windows 8. HTML5 is a first-class citizen for building Windows 8 applications. That is huge. That is unprecedented in Microsoft history. Right? You can use a standards-based open technology, and I mean, I'm trying to think. I don't think I've written any code here that integrates with Windows 8 yet. I eventually will, right? They'll be sharing and blah, blah, blah. This code that I wrote here, I could just put up on the web. HTML5, CSS, JavaScript. Okay? They have done an unprecedented thing by making HTML5 a first-class development environment. They care deeply about HTML5. And they have to. The world has chosen HTML5 and JavaScript. Yes, Adam.
More of a comment, but to answer a little bit back to your question, is the other thing I might throw in there is Visual Studio is almost $1 billion business now for Microsoft. So there's a good intention there as well.
So you're saying it gets JavaScript developers more likely into Visual Studio?
Possibly.
Yeah, so John Bristow's comment was, hey, Microsoft makes money on Visual Studio. They want it to be the most capable tool it can possibly be. That may be true. Anyone else have any comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Just a comment as an FYI. Quick search at Google shows us about 3 or 4 different HTTP handlers.
Oh.
Including one that does both TS and less.
So we did a quick Google search, and we found an HTTP handler for ASP.NET that does TypeScript to JavaScript conversion on the fly. So that's cool. That's very cool.
One good case study that I read about was Brian Harry did convert the whole of Team Web Access, or TFS Visual Studio in the cloud, to
TypeScript?
TypeScript.
Oh, wow.
And he said it was incredibly well tested what they already had, and it found a dozen or so substantial bugs.
That doesn't surprise me at all. And as I mentioned, just to repeat for the folks out there in webland, Adam is saying, hey, Brian Harry ported the major web front end for TFS to TypeScript and found a dozen or more major bugs when he did that, just moving it to TypeScript. I have seen people just move to TypeScript just for that reason, right? Without even using any of the features. Now, and then once you get there, and I did this when I built my templates, right? I took their JavaScript and didn't just copy it over and call it a TypeScript file. I actually ported it to TypeScript, to best practices TypeScript. Just to get, and then I double checked to make sure I was generating all the right JavaScript. Steve?
Curiosity, did you find any bugs in the original templates when you did that?
Good question. Steve asked if I found any bugs. As it turns out, I was the program manager for this set of templates when I was at Microsoft, so of course I found 0 bugs when I did this work. All right. Yes?
One last thing, just an observation that I was trying to convert our developers to using CoffeeScript, say 12 months ago.
Sure.
And I had an interesting conversation with one of the designers that I have in Brazil, who's just a designer doing a lot of web design.
Sure.
And when he had a look at that, he came to me and said, "You're not going to believe this, Adam. I know you think I write a lot of JavaScript, but I don't write any JavaScript. I'm always finding stuff on the web, and I'm copy and paste and put it in. I never write from scratch, so I'm very frightened of CoffeeScript." The same thing would apply to this, wouldn't it?
Well, it's the comment was, hey, designers don't really write programs, they just copy and paste. It's kind of interesting. JavaScript enables that kind of culture, right? I remember that my first experience with jQuery was before I was a real JavaScript programmer. I mean, the last 2 years I've been doing JavaScript, and it's been a steep ramp. And I've been now, I actually, that's how I think of things first, is JavaScript. But before that, probably 6 months to a year before that, I wanted to build a cool website that built a shopping cart and did all kinds of cool things that I like shopping carts to do. And I used jQuery. I didn't even know. I knew that I could use jQuery to do these things. I didn't know what jQuery was doing. I didn't know what JavaScript was doing. All I did was sort of guess based on the samples of the jQuery and then kind of drop it into my website. And then I kept hacking on it and banging on it until it worked, which is, I believe, how 99% of the websites in the world are built, right?
Copy and paste, edit for taste.
That's right.
This actually would be good to check the plugin code, jQuery plugin codes, because I see that a lot of the plugins are written carelessly. Say this.
In my experience, a lot of the JavaScript in the world is written carelessly. And to be fair, the tools enable that. Right? There's nobody checking. The whole web was if we have an error in the HTML, I'll just ignore it. We got an error in the CSS, we'll just ignore it. We got an error in the JavaScript, we'll just ignore it. Right? That is the whole web. And arguably, that is the reason it now controls the world. Because it works well enough. Is it perfect? Is it great all the time? No. Are there errors in there all the time that if you turned on debugging mode, you would see? You could even surf the web for more than 3 pages if you turned on that mode, right? But we still use it all day, every day. It works pretty damn well.
It's the world's largest app store.
It is indeed the world's largest app store. And on that note, yes, sir, question. No, that's quite all right.
Is there anything in there that sort of helps you write cross-browser, IE6 compatible JavaScript? I know you said you can compile it that to ECMAScript.
Good question. Are there any features in TypeScript that allow you to support cross-browser code and IE6 code? And the answer is, I will say 2 things. One, there is a switch that says, give me ECMAScript 3 code. And I don't remember the version of that ECMAScript that IE6 supports, but that sounds familiar, right? That's probably why that switch is there for IE6. And 2, I will tell you, TypeScript allows you to access all of your existing JavaScript libraries, including jQuery, which of course is famous for that kind of smoothing over the browser differences. Okay.
The next version is going to go up on that.
I understand. The next version of jQuery will not, but luckily they make the previous versions available. So.
It depends on compatibility. Visual compatibility versus, raw.
But it wasn't one of their aims to make sure, like, I've only started JavaScript programming in the last 2.5 months, and I've then written JavaScript and realized, testing it in IE6, that it doesn't support, like, for each that I was using failed, I think, in IE7. And I didn't find that out till I was going through all these browser checks. So, but I'm wondering if there was if that was in TypeScript's mission at all to do any sort of help.
Yeah, good question. Even though TypeScript will compile to ECMAScript 3 compatible code, I don't believe it will check the constructs you're using and make sure that they're ECMAScript 3. For example, it may not even catch that for each bug that you... When it generates its own constructs, right, it will make them ECMAScript 3. But I haven't actually tried that. I'm a little worried about what kind of code will come out when I say ECMAScript 3.
Be kind of interesting to modify the HTTP handler to almost dynamically choose ECMA3 or ECMA5.
Oh, right, based on the target. I wonder, probably the HTTP handler is already dynamically checked, or at least one that would, right? Okay, so to summarize, I believe TypeScript is all about adding those kind of professional software engineering language constructs that we really need to build real apps. And I believe that a big part of the reason is because Microsoft is busy building real JavaScript apps, not just to ship in the Windows Store, but if you look at Office, right? Those are hundreds of thousands of lines of code of JavaScript, and they tried with a kind of a C# to JavaScript compiler, and that just fell down because the concepts didn't map, right? So what Anders has built here is a way to take the existing JavaScript that we know and love and add in optional features that help us write even better JavaScript. And because of that, I'm a fan. And thanks very much.